to do this talk. And second, to Koen and all the organizers for putting together. I can't imagine a happier place I'd rather be than people talking about these things, particularly today, tone, of course. And finally, I want to thank all of you for not running away. Because I have been at Bantu tone talks, but I haven't thought about it. So I hope I won't disappoint because I have clearly too much on this handout. So I'll have to jump around. But I wanted also to say that I was realizing that I had met A.E. Mayerson at the third Conference on African Languages in 1972. Tilo was just referred to that at the very same time when he had just arrived in Leiden. And it was a time when the CALL conference would sit around one conference table. And there were all these amazing people from the Lodemi project, from Stoppers, and Coupé was there, and Mayerson, and then a number of their students like Claire Grégoire and Yvonne Destin, and I'm sure I'm forgetting Louise Bolac.
Pieper.
What?
Pieper.
Yeah, Klaus Pieper. And it was a real eye-opener for me because I came to talk about universals and tone rules in West Africa, and work that I'd done with Rush Hugh. And I know there was a lot of disagreement and rumbling and interruptions and complaints that was going on, and eagerness and calmness, all these say, when someone had raised an objection to a generalization I believe it was Coupé, he said, oui, mais il faut admettre que c'est le seul exemple qu'on connaisse. You know, it's the only exception to what he's saying that we know. And that settled the whole thing. Okay, well, it sounds like I'm going to be talking about a very small issue, but I hope that you'll see that actually it's something that ties together a lot of stuff and is of potential interest, I think. Whatever the final answer is, I'll take a position on it, or the same one I've taken before, but I have to be honest about it. I'll be wanting your opinions afterwards to see what you think when I've shown it to you. It's something that Mayerson mentions in many places, actually, about the fact that the verb extension, the causative, not the causative, the things like the reciprocal and the applicative and so forth, these derivational suffixes were supposed to not have a tonal contrast. They were either low or zero, and they took their tones from the final vowel. That was his idea, except as you can read in all these quotes I have at the beginning, there seemed to be sometimes a high tone effect of the short causative E and the short passive E, degree 2 U, but this needs to be studied some more. Okay, it just shows up here and there. So that's what I did. To illustrate number 3, here's examples from Nyala West, from Michael's work. And you can see in the first line of the causative, where they are not shaping him, the verb ends all low. So unmarked there is low tone, beka, low, low. But when you have the causative, he's not making him shave, there's the E and it has a high tone. And if you look to the right, the first sentence, we shaved, again, ends all low. But if you have the passive, he was shaved, then again the U has a high tone. So where's this high tone coming from? Number 4 shows you what I just said and what Michael was already referred to, and Tito as well, that what the expectation was from Meyerson's work from 1961, but also the Bantu grammatical reconstructions, is that all of these vowels that were between the first vowel of the root and the last vowel, the final vowel, they're all toneless. There's no contrast there. They copy their tones from the right, this way. And you can see that in the examples from Ombo, from Mayerson 1961 there, where the first group in A ends all low, and the second group either has a low or a high on the first vowel, and then the rest is all high. And he attributed that to the underlying tone to the final vowel. Okay, rather than saying there's a high and you assign it this way, he said it's coming from the final ah or that kind of thing. But the unraveling in number 4 of the tonal properties potentially requires an understanding of the relationship between the final vowels, in part because of Meyerson's claim that it had to do with the final vowel, that the tone and the final vowel are intimately connected. And also because, as I'll show you, there are some cases, in fact, where this high tone, this unexpected high tone actually correlates with the change of the final vowel, as in Luganda and Usoga. Okay, so there are 2 hypotheses in number 5. The first is that the consonant, the causative passive high, CPH is what I'm using for that, is reconstructible to Proto-Bantu. And the second hypothesis is that the causative passive high was innovated after Proto-Bantu. Now, of the two hypotheses, the first one, 5A, is the easy way out. If we reconstruct it there, then all we have to do is talk about how it was lost. And since it's lost in most Bantu languages, we mostly don't have to explain anything. On the other hand, if we say that it was innovated, then we have to figure out how it happened. Okay, that where did this extra high tone come from if it was not there on the E and the U from the beginning? So the organization here is I'm going to first present arguments that seem to support 5B, which is the position I originally took with Francis Katamba, that it was innovated. And then I will talk about some other cases of high tone suffixes, extensions that I think are not related. And then the last part, I'll discuss some possible scenarios by which the high tone may have come in the way that it's shaped that it has. So the potential arguments are given in number 7. And the first is that the causative passive high is found on both E and U only in some interlacustrine languages, so JD and JE. And these are listed in number 8. Okay, the ones that we found with a lot of help from Michael Marlowe. Finding the languages there, you'll see they're all JD or JE, by which I mean both on the causative and on the passive. Okay? Second, in the languages that invert, that Michael talked about, where the marked tone is low versus 0, in those languages, the high on the passive or the causative doesn't invert. It's still a high tone. So that suggests that must have post-dated it or something like that, that it's exempt from inversion. So third, 7C is typically restricted to certain tenses that have an inflectional melodic tone that Michael also referred to. That is not the verbs that have that end with all toneless vowels. Okay, so you don't get it there. And in D, sometimes it seems to be inserted late in a synchronic or diachronic derivation, whether we're talking one way or the other. You do everything else and then say, oh, by the way, now put in a high tone if you've got one of these guys. That's what it looks like. And sometimes it correlates with other unexpected tonal and segmental effects on the final vowel, I already mentioned. And finally, the causative passive high is realized locally, either on the E or U, or right next to it by a regular rule, versus other high tones, melodic high tones, which can go all over the place, as we saw from Ikuria, they can, or other language where they wander around. This one doesn't wander around, it just stays put. Okay, that kind of thing. Okay. Additional languages in number 9 have been mentioned also by Mayerson as having this, but I have found that going through Holo Holo, so that's Holo Holo, Lega, and Herero, and I'll mention all three. I have all three of them on the handout. I've gone through all of the tiroirs of Coupe, all of these different cells in the paradigm, and I cannot find any reason to think that it has a high tone specifically. And the same thing with Lega, which keeps in number 11. I'm not going to go through the details, but you kind of want there. What you do have, and if you just look at number 12, what you do have is sometimes when an E or an U is present in the last syllable, therefore creating a bimoraic final syllable, consonant E vowel or consonant U vowel, that the tonal pattern is a little different. But oftentimes that comes out from the actual rules themselves. So, for example, here's an example from Lee Bickmore, Lungu, in 12, where you can see in 12a that when you have a high tone in the verb, it spreads all the way to the penultimate vowel. So, the high tone of the subject prefix tu goes all the way to the penult in A. When there is a causative or passive present, either the U of the passive in we are being washed, or the is-e coming out ish. The long causative always occurred with an e after it in Proto-Bantu, ish-e. Instead of it being going to the penultimate vowel, it goes to the final vowel. So that is very easily captured by simply saying that the spreading is to the penultimate mora, and then when the final CVV shortens to CV, instead of getting a falling tone as you would expect, you get a high tone. Okay, so there's a lot of that kind of stuff there. I have some other references there, and I'm sure there are many more where you get a difference for that. What we need in order to have an example of causative passive high are cases where it's clear that it's the presence of the E or U that is giving us an extra high tone that would not otherwise be there. So here's another example, 13, from Kitembo. And in these you see I'm catching something or someone, just goes nasimba. But when you have the Y from E or the W from U, it goes all the way to the end. Now this might look like the same thing I just showed you, but if you look at the low tone verb, this is a high tone verb, sim. If you look at the low tone verb, ko, you'll see that nakola ends low, but when the causative is there from kol, E becoming kos, there's a final high tone. And also in the last one, the kolelwa, from the W, you're getting a final high tone. So that's the extra high tone that is the causative passive high tone. Note from the proto forms on the right that I give you there, that this is a language where the tones are inverted, but the effect of the passive or the causative is a high tone seal. So that's what I was referring to. That tone did not get inverted. Now, in most, if not all, of the causative passive high languages, the causative passive high only occurs in tense aspect mood combinations that assign an inflectional high or melodic tone or an inverted low. That is, they're not the ones that end with a zero inflection. Okay. So we need that as part of the. That's one of the hints of something there that maybe that's not an accident. That something you always have some other melodic tone that you're assigning in order to get the extra high tone. Okay? And the second thing is you're only going to be able to see that high tone if the way the melodic tone works is that it shifts off the final vowel away from the constant W vowel or the constant Y vowel that you get at the end curve. Okay, so to see that, what I should, and I'll mention here, and we'll see it later, that there's a second condition besides the tonal one, that it has to have a melodic tone. And that is in Luganda and Lusoga, which are almost mutually intelligible. In those languages, you have to be in the tenses also that have ile, the ile ending, the Proto-Bantu ile. So in addition to having to have the tone. So that's the way that it works. Now the condition, the first condition you can see here, like in Kinande, which is one of the languages with this. In the first example, you see the verb ends all low, umira. Okay? But when you add, and then when you add the causative, it ends umisya. So this is one of those tenses that does not have a melodic tone. So when you add the causative there, the isya or the irwa in the last example, we will be hit for, you don't get a high tone. So in other words, the causative never, or the passive, never introduces a high tone into a form that would not have had a melodic tone. That would have ended toneless like that. But in the next tense, where I've indicated the melodic tone is a high between those angled brackets, you can see in the outputs, first of all, with the low tone verb hum, what happens is that you have a high tone in the output that goes on the root hum and on the mu, the object prefix that precedes it. You said we hit for him. So the mu hum are both high. That's coming from shifting from the final vowel high tone over there. So it's getting out of the way. That's good. Okay. Now when you add the isya or the irwa there with the causative and the passive, you'll see we've got one more high tone. The is high, the ir is high. It's actually from the e and the u, but Kinande has tone anticipation on the preceding mora, and that's why it's where it is there. Okay, so that illustrates the fact that we needed that high melodic tone, which moved way into the mu hum in that case, leaving room for the causative high or the passive high to get in there. Okay. Now note, as I say here in 16, what's important about this also is note in 15b that the suffixal high, the melodic high that shifts way in onto the mu hum there, is realized to the left of the causative passive high. Okay. If the causative passive high had been there in Proto-Bantu, how did it get around it? That would be the question. Why didn't it stop it or something like that? It'd be kind of a strange set of facts. That's one of the arguments suggesting that it was innovated, that it's kind of coming in from another plane or something, that something else is causing it. I'll get to that later. Okay, let's see. So if I give the derivation in 19 shows you this in more detail for the Kinande case, and this is actually related to some things that Michael said in a moment. So if we start with the Meilson reconstruction in this Kinande example with a high melodic tone on the final vowel, remember that's where Meilson put it in Bantu reconstructions. The first thing that happens is that you copy it one to the left in Kinande, and then you then also anticipate it. I'm sorry, you copy it by the rule that Meilson said that anything that's in between the root and the final vowel copies that tone. So that's why in 19C you have two high tones. Okay. Now Kinande also has high tone anticipation, so it goes one more. Okay. Now at this point we have Meilson's rule, the rule that what? Did I do something wrong?
The first mo.
Oh, the first mo. I'm not talking about that. I'm sorry. Is something wrong?
No, but what prefix?
Which prefix? The mo prefix?
Yeah,
it's a tense prefix. Yeah, it's a pre-initial tense prefix. That isn't playing any role here. I mean, I can talk about that later if you like, but I'm talking about the tones on the right edge, of course. Here, so the high tones, so we've got three high tones, and Meilson's rule will take a sequence of highs and make all but the first one low, and that's what you see there, and that's why the high is so far in. That was just referred to in the discussion a moment ago. And then there's one more tone anticipation, which Butaka in his book does as a cyclic rule. But so it comes out the way you see there, okay, with the two high tones like that. Now when you have the causative thing, we have to first do this and then throw in a high tone. That's the whole point that this is showing, okay? Let's see. The other thing that happens there, I say in 20, is that Kinande shows this also very nicely. One of the things that happens is that when the high is present there when we causative passive, it actually takes the low tone that you see in the output of 19. You see those lows at the end. Those lows are there to stop high tone, the high boundary tone from coming in. If those lows had been 0, then at the end of an utterance, a high tone would have come in, marking the boundary. So the intonational high tone would have come in. But these lows block that. But it just so happens, I'm not going to put any detail here because it takes, it's a little complicated, but the fact is that when you have that extra high tone, the low that's on the last vowel also goes away. So now it's a 0. So there's some very bizarre stuff going on. I think that's the only thing you need to take from that. Okay? Okay. I mentioned before, 21, that Uganda and Lusoga require that you have the ile ending, which comes out ye usually. But here I gave the examples in 21, Tufir or Utya. And this is Lusoga. And we have here this tuti ile. Now Lusoga has high anticipation on the preceding mora. So that's why the ku is high tone in Tufir. You can see the ile there. And you can see it ends it's all low except there's a final boundary tone high. So I wish we could just ignore it here for the purpose of this discussion. But notice that when we have the causative, we have cause to fear, you get an extra high tone in there. Coming from the underlined Z, which is from, there's an E after that, that's causative. Similarly, we have been feared, you get an extra high tone coming from the Ibu, the long form of the passive. And then we've got them both together, an Is followed by an Ibwa. Then we've been made to fear, then you again get the one high tone. It's on the penultimate syllable because of high tone anticipation. This is also a language that shifts the high onto the preceding mora. Okay, so that's showing you the fact that you get this with the ile. You don't see the ile in there. It's all an imbricated term of Yvonne Vestas. Okay. The last the last argument in support of innovation is the fact that the causative passive high is always realized locally, either on the syllable with the E or U, or on its neighbor, or high tone anticipation, HGA as pi. Okay. So if this high tone had been there from the beginning, why hasn't it migrated? If it was there from the beginning, why didn't it stop the high tone from the final vowel going through it, and so forth. So it's really kind of clumsy. Okay. Now it's always assumed in all these examples, in all the discussion, as far as I can tell, all of the discussion, including the work that Francis and I did, we always talk about examples where the causative or passive vowel was in the last syllable of the word. But it is possible, as I recently determined, in some Bantu languages, for that E or U to not be in the last syllable, okay? And that is for us to get a glide earlier than in the last syllable, and where the last syllable can lack it. And the question is, well, what happens in that case? What if the E or the Y or W is not in the last syllable? And this can come up in verb stem reduplication, and can come up in sequences of E or U followed by the reciprocal, especially agan in the Banda and the Soga. Okay? So if you look at the reduplications, first of all, let's take the case of kinande, which reduplicates the verbs. Let's see, do I want to do kinande or should I skip that? Let me skip that. But actually, the generalization in this area, there are different types of tonal patterns, as Laura has pointed out, for what happens with tone in verb reduplication. But in this area, what happens is that if you have a high tone root and you reduplicate, it only occurs on the first stem. Okay? If you have a melodic tone coming from the right, it gets calculated over the whole thing. Okay? So if it's supposed to go on the final vowel, it'll be on the final vowel of the whole thing. If it's supposed to go on the second mora, it'll be on the second mora of the first stem. Okay? So you've got kind of a left-right difference there. That the root high is on the first stem of the reduplication, whereas the suffixal high, the melodic tone, can go wherever it's supposed to go, calculating over the whole thing. Okay, but that isn't what happens in these examples in Lusoga. Okay, so to fear again, okutya, we have feared. There's the ile that you get after a CV verb. And as you can see, it reduplicates, these reduplicate just with the final boundary tone, the high at the end there. Okay, now when we have the high tone from the causative, to tisiza, we have cause to fear. It comes out to tisiza, tisiza. Okay, this is what my speaker gave me. He must be right. He's a priest. Okay, so anyway, and you can see that now the high tone is there where you would have gotten the ile imbricating there, and it's on the first stem. Okay, it's not on the end. Okay, so it's doing, and the same thing with the passive there in the next example. We don't get a tone copying of that, obviously, but the interesting thing is that being on the first stem, it looks like it's doing what root tones do. That is, it's going with the first one, not with the second one. Okay, and that's what that shows. And that is very different from what you see in F and G, where you see that final, that penultimate falling tone in this particular relative form. Well, in the replication, you get it on the right. Okay, so this is not acting like a melodic tone, it's acting more like a root tone, like it's a tone of the morpheme. It belongs to E and U. It's not coming in as marking a construction or something like that. Okay? The second example is where you have the reciprocal agan, which causes all kinds of interesting problems in the soga and the ganda. But you can see that we have this imbrication in the first example. Agan ile comes out againe, final boundary tone. If we add the causative to that, so this is where we've got the causative only preceding it, and we don't have the causative passive high because the Y is inside there, not combining with the ile. Whereas if you put the Y, copy it on the other side of the agan, you do get the extra high tone. So you get to lumya. Okay? And notice the A changes to A. That was what I was referring to. The final null also goes from A to A. And in the other case is the same. So kubya, kubya versus kubya gainya. So it's crucial that the two combine together, the ile and the Y. We don't get it just from the one. That is, we need them both together. So this is a case of where we can get, in the first example of A and C, we can actually, where we don't get the Y or the W in the last syllable, we don't get the high tone there either. Okay. It's hard to get, I think I'll skip it. There is a passive example I've sort of finessed there, which shows essentially the same thing. They married each other, so But when you have the W inside there, it puts it on the preceding E there, okay? And so we don't, in fact, I saw that after I left home, and I thought that if I made a mistake, it should be a B, not an L, but E, well, but I don't remember now. Okay. Okay, a lot of this has to do with the problem of agan. I just wanted to point out here, there's some very interesting things going on where with agan, there's sometimes this double exponents where the ile is spelled out twice. What we expect is tu tiagaine, where you just get the ile imbricating into the agan, but in fact you can get tuti le gaine. Sorry, gaine should be high tone at the end. And that's that they're treating these things as two parts. They're putting ile on both sides of this agan. Okay. Okay, so that's pretty much the illustration of the phenomenon. The next section has 5 minutes. Yes. Start late. Anyway, the next section has just a very quick, maybe I'll even skip it, discussion about the other languages that have been reported to have high tone extensions. For example, Chichewa, which has a contrast, as you can see there in 27, between two kinds of extensions. Chitonga, the Malawian Tonga, has an eek suffix that either is stative without a high tone or is passive with a high tone. And then there's stuff that you see from Herero, which I mostly would dismiss as Kero did, but I think wrongly in that case. There's certainly some things going on there, but in fact the only really high tone suffix is the passive, the last line there. Okay, and there are examples of 30. Now the reason I'm setting these aside is that the causative is never high in these languages. And in fact, if you look at the high tone suffixes, they tend to be intransitivizers. Okay, and the stative, the reversive, the intransitive, the passive, and so forth. There's something going on there with intransitivization, and these are languages. When I said that we only find the causative passive high in JD and JE, that is an interlacustream. What I meant to say was that that's the only place where you get them both. That the causative is not high in any of these languages. Okay, so I think something else is going on here, and I'll just have to skip the rest of that. Okay, so the question then 32, I think I'll make it, is why then do we have synchronic causative passive high? Any solution must account for why it's limited to E and U, and why it's dependent on there being an inflectional stem tone, a melodic tone. Meyerson's final reconstruction of the final vowel high. Potentially, there are two types of explanations for the unique development of causative passive high in interlacustream Bantu. One is morphological, and the other is phonological. So it's something to do with the function or the structure being different from other verb extensions. The phonological would be E and U are the only vowel extensions, all others being BC, that's possible. E and U also occur late in the verb stem, okay? Well, I have actually entertained two different morphological speculations. I don't know if either of them helps, really, but they're very speculative. First, the E and U used to be voice suffixes, only later acquiring a final vowel. Verbs would have ended E or U. That would make them different. Second is that they fused with an A and maybe formed a separate enclitic after the verb. This is what Francis Katamba and I discussed in Uganda to try to take account not only of the tone, but the change of A to A, the final vowel. Okay. We know this, and this already came up in Jackie's talk actually, we know there is some kind of difference that happens with, in other parts, in other situations, the E, the nominalizer E is instead A, the causative is there. And I think I put some, did I not put some examples? If the east is there, then it would tend to come out A instead of E. There are some other E, oh yeah, I'm sorry, 35 is showing that there are some other E suffixes, but there also is the case of the differences. There are languages where the final vowel is A, or is one thing if there is no extension, it's another thing if there is an extension. and we might be able to build on that, okay? Again, I'm going to skip around. Okay. Okay. There's another thing about Uganda that is important here that played into the idea that maybe the causative passive form an enclitic, and that is when you have this extra high tone, the verb does not form a tone group with what follows. So typically, in most tenses, if you had a verb and then anything that follows an object, whatever it is, an enclitic, they will join together to make one tone group, and a tone rule will apply there. If the causative passive high is there, it blocks. Okay, as if the causative passive is itself satisfying that member that following the verb, as if it's outside the verb. That was what we pointed out in Uganda. Okay, so I'll skip that too. Okay, so now turning in 42 to phonological accounts, could we just get this somehow from phonology rather than having to do anything fancy with changing the verb structure? Well, the Indu are only realized late. This is 42A. There will only be extensions among the extensions. Okay, so here's what will be needed if we assume that it is from a single inflectional high. Because remember, that was the condition. Maybe the high of the E and U is really just the inflectional high spelled out a second time. Okay, somehow surviving. So if we started with the high on the final vowel without the causative passive high in 43A, we would first copy it in as Meyerson proposed. Okay, and then we would lower the highs to low by Meyerson's rule. Okay, if you had the extra B there in B, 43B, what we would need is, again, copying the highs all the way in, applying Meyerson's rule or some kind of lowering there that maybe applied first on the final syllable, and then when we try to do Meyerson's rule, we would make that high-low falling tone exempt from lowering. That would be one possible way to do it. I go in here to talk about another way of doing it. Yeah, I knew I had all these things here with the adjectives coming up and all that, but since I'm running out of time, another way to have done it would have been to say the lows are actually, the Meyerson's rule is lows coming in this way, and when it gets to the final high-low on the last syllable, it can't lower a high that's in a high-low syllable. Okay, so it will leave a high tone, let's say, on the second mora, because we'll have highs on all those moras, then some lows, and then finally a high-low, and that would be our second high tone. So we have to play with something like that to make it work phonologically. Okay? I'll leave you to read through the other stuff that I had to skip. Just go through the conclusions. My gut feeling is that causative passive high was innovated in early interlacustrine. It had to do with the presence of melodic tone, if not also ile, but it has been later modified and ultimately lost. In most of the interlacustrine languages, the prevalence of high tone anticipation, allowing an ultimate analysis with high to low, as Michael talked about as well, is noteworthy. Okay, the fact that we had the Meyerson's rule that gave us those low tones that could be replaced by another high is important. The contrastive high tone extensions that we find elsewhere, as in Guerrero and so forth, I don't think is related. I think those are not related. So one final question on the last page. Can the tone of verbal extensions outside Bantu help us? I think there's a data bit, but don't have any time. So the main moral that we can draw, which Tilo referred to this morning, from all the above undoubtedly comes from the master himself. I'll let you read the fact that we all need to work together. So I'll ask you for your help. Thank you.
Okay, we have 5-10 minutes for questions.
I'm puzzled by something which is a bit orthogonal to the view topic. I'm worried about the fact that when the year is before that, how can it not have a moral? How do you present that?
Oh, yeah, first of all, in a number of the languages, including Luganda and Soga, when you have the Y before the Agam, the vowel is short, actually. I mean,
So here is not a vowel. Then I would say here is not a vowel.
Oh, no, whether it has it or not depends on its position. When it's in the trough, when it's in between the first and last syllable, then you don't get a long vowel. Okay? So that's kind of nice in that respect. So labyagana, you know, see, cause to see each other, you know, it's short, labyagana. Okay? Versus if it's in the last syllable, it'll be long. If you put, there is final vowel shortening, but if you put clitic after it, it'll be long.
And
of course,
normally you expect,
yeah.
you expect some, I mean, a vowel which is followed, a consonant followed by a palatal plus a vowel, you expect it to be bimoraic.
Yeah, you do expect it. It was a surprise to me. But that's part of the structure that's going on. And that also, I think, is a recent restructuring of the verb. Sam, Sharon Nicholas and I just published an article on multiple exponents in Lusoga. And basically what's happening is that instead of getting the analysis agan, an, they take the first is thinking that that's a final vowel and make it laba, or let's say bona, and then gana. And they do it that way. And we know that because in the subjunctive, it at least optionally comes out bone, gane. Okay? And the equivalent of bonile, ganile. Okay, but with imbrication, right? I showed you that, I'm sure, too rapidly. But there's basically been some restructuring there. Okay? And the fact that that plays into whether you get the high or not, I think is more evidence that the high is kind of a recent epiphenomenal thing, rather than having been there from the beginning.
Yeah, I'm sorry, do you claim that anything which is in the trough will never be, any such combination in the trough will never be long?
Unless this is typical OT. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to get into this. There's definitely, there's this thing called faithfulness, right? If the language has something like ulu or something, that long vowel will survive. So it will not create new long vowels in the trough. You know, what I call prosodic trough. Yeah.
Michael?
Yeah, just another neat, I think, example is showing kind of the late effects of tone with the causative and passive. In Nyala, Nyala West, there's a conditional past construction.
It's all low?
It's all low, and it's like aggressively low. So if you add a object marker, the object markers which are normally always high, are lowered there. You can have multiple objects. You can add all kinds of, anything that would add a high sort of at the left, it gets lowered in that construction. But when you put a causative or passive in, it goes up to high at the end.
Yeah, it's really bizarre. I mean, it's obvious, I think I said that maybe also, obviously everything I said was too fast. But the fact is that we can't take any of the current languages as representing what must have been there originally to give this. So I'm sure that at some point this thing got generalized in some of the languages, say, if you've got a passive, particularly in a language where you don't have evidence for zero, for absence of melodic tone, you know, and so you always get the high. So none of the languages represent the original when this thing was originally innovated, assuming that's right. But I don't think it was there in Proto-Bantu. I think it was there in Proto-Bantu. So if you know of other languages that we haven't found yet, let us know. Also, because we're looking, but it really looks like it's an interlacustrine phenomenon, but not all of them have it. Yeah.
It's just because I'm not fully up to speed with Proto-Bantu and reconstruction. But your point 48a there had to do with so it had to do with resident melodic tone. Are you saying that it's this final vowel melodic tone that has been sort of stolen by by the causative and
yeah, I mean that was my phonological suggestion. Again, it's not that I have 100% confidence. This is one of those situations where it's easy to find a solution, but hard to find a solution that you can have confidence in. So as I say, my gut feeling is that there's obviously a relationship there, because in the languages that have zero, you know, the absence of the melodic tone, you don't get anything happening with the causative or the passive there. So it needs to piggyback on that. So it's like parasitic on the melodic tone. But the melodic tone, as I showed you in Kinande, just goes way inside, and then another high appears out here on the causative or the passive, you know. And so in that case, I would say, well, there must have been something about being there in that bimeridic syllable that protected it. Again, it's not that I'm so familiar. The one thing I do know is if you have low tone spreading into a high syllable, there are many languages where it will not spread into a high-low syllable. Okay, so low, high, high might become low, low, high, but low, falling, high will not change. Okay, so if I could get that high, low, and if I get it to be a falling tone instead of a high tone, maybe that could protect it. That was the idea. And then in between, the other guys are not protected, so you're going to have this going down to low and coming back up again.
But that means that sorry, just to understand this, in some languages, the E and U really stole the tone and took it for themselves and can just like use it wherever. And in other languages it didn't, and it's still dependent on that tone or that melodic tone still being there. Is that right? Is that what
I'm not sure. By stolen, it's not that it's there instead of being somewhere else necessarily, although there is some interaction in some of the languages, the Luya languages. You might get it next to another high and one of them will go away, you know, that kind of thing. So, but it's not that it steals it, it's that it doubles it. Okay, so that you get it twice. You get a second spell out. Which
but
is,
in all languages then?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, well, I can't exactly say that because the example that Michael just mentioned is not two high tones. It's an all low tone pattern. That must be some development from an earlier something else. But we're still getting that high tone generalized. At some point, the language just says, "I want a high tone there on the passive and the causative." Period. You know, and that isn't the original situation.
No, right. Yeah.
If it were the original, then I would be saying that those guys had a Proto-Bantu high tone.
No,
Yeah, and that's not what I'm saying. But again, if we can
There's
find
no
some better
language.
way to do this, what?
There's no language which has infinitives of a low tone verb class, and suddenly, if they're causative, there's a high tone appearing.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Usually, but not always, the infinitive ends 0 or lower. And there's none where the infinitive with a causative or passive gets a high tone. That doesn't exist. That's what we don't have any clear case of that. Jeff?
I was wondering if you could comment, the data in 26 is not totally related to the talk, but somewhat, where the final vowel changes in Musoga, where the A of Ile is lost and becomes A. I guess when you have the causative, is that right?
Which one?
The 26.
E and F?
No, sorry, data 26, B and D,
Oh, yeah.
where this A appears.
Oh, yeah, right, exactly.
Do you have any thoughts on that? What's happening?
Well, that's what Francis, the top, what we said was, we said that's a separate constituent, and it ends with the default A.
Yeah.
You know, that it was like the ya and the wa were separate clitics.
Except for Musoga.
Yeah,
too,
that
right?
was our idea, because that did two things. One, it gave us the A, and two, it said the wa or the ya was actually a clitic. Therefore, if you put something after those guys, you don't form a tone group together. Okay, because the wa and the ya are filling that post-verbal spot.
So Luganda does that too then, right?
Yeah, the Luganda and Musoga both do that.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean with different details, but
They both have that.
actually, yeah, they both do that.
But when you said there was there were some segmental effects, that's what you meant.
That's what I
And
meant.
it's
The
just-
A coming out
Okay.
Yeah. There's a reference to Chiwini in here where the passive of the ile also has an A. So that's really, but there's no W. It just changes ile to ila.
Oh, no, you want.
Yeah, it's not ila. You know, so that's the only example I know with that, and I know that she wants to stop us.
The consonant is like
Yeah.
that. It's not the same liquid.
What?
So the consonant is different, right? In this case, it means L, not the other.
Well, the two different L's.
Yeah.
Yeah, the L changes.
It must be liquid.
Yeah, maybe. Right.
Okay.
That's enough?
That's-
Okay.